So, Redemption,
Right.
powerful song both lyrically and musically. As a former combat officer, did you draw upon personal experience for inspiration?
So the personal experience that I drew from with Redemption was based on a number of things. As a combat leader in the military, I don't suffer from PTSD, but a lot of folks that I've worked with, have. In my former community, I served in a small unit context in the military, in kind of like a unique setting. And in my old community, it seemed as if over the last couple of years, it looked like we were losing guys, at the rate of like one a month. Guys coming back, and guys that had been dealing with a lot of things.
What is the biggest misconception you think the general public has about PTSD?
I think that, believe it or not, I think most people nowadays, there's been so much attention to it since the 80s, that starting with the first Gulf War, and then, carrying through the 90s, and then with Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and everything else, since 2001, there's been so much of an emphasis on veterans' needs that I think the general public actually is pretty mindful and very well aware of the needs of veterans. When it comes to misconceptions, I do know that from personal experience, just in the type of environment I came from, there are people that just automatically assume that I have it. And that gets a little strange because, I was in a band at one point where after a couple of weeks, the drummer where we had were rehearsing said, so he's like, and he was kind of dancing around the subject. And I said, look, you tell your wife that I'm not going to flip out in her house, or that, your family's safe, There are people that I think, that swing of the pendulum kind of starts to go the other way sometimes. And so if you're a combat vet, or if you've served in a line unit, or, a direct action unit, sometimes people just automatically assume that everybody has it. And so there's kind of that to deal with, but it's not, I'd rather explain that I don't.
Yeah, for sure. Since you said you've known quite a few people that do have it, have you noticed anything that does help them, like any suggestions that you can put out there for people that are suffering that haven't sought help yet?
I do know people, and somebody that was very close to me, that is very close to me, they suffer from PTSD, and you can do as much as you can to try to assist, but in the end, it's like any other very personal, psychological, emotional need, is they have to ultimately do the work for themselves, whether that's get themselves into treatment or whatever. And with PTSD, when I interfaced with the VA and a veterans group to assist this one person, they were very interested and very much wanted to be involved. And so that's the good thing, is that the organizations are there. The interest and the desire and the intent of the people that work in these organizations is there for them they're very motivated to assist. In some cases, you have guys that will want to open up with buddies that they were with, as opposed to talking about it with, friends or family. And a lot of that, I think, at least in my case, veterans have a whole host of other issues sometimes coming out of the military that have nothing to do with PTSD. There's the fact that you can sit there and feel exceptionally lonely because you're looking around and nobody's going to understand what you have to say. Your sense of humor is, can sometimes be a little off-center. And, a lot of times it's what they would call gallows humor, and there's a certain camaraderie that comes into play with all of these things. And so when veterans, both male and female, leave the service and get out, it's kind of looking around, it's like, who am I going to talk to about any of this? That's where you get into some difficulties in it. And so a lot of times, like in my case, it was kind of like, geez, you start to get frustrated and sometimes it's easier just to pick up the phone and talk to an old buddy and realize, okay, it's not me,
Right.
it's everybody else. They just don't get me, but the people that I work with and
Right.
and-
Your
and-
tribe gets you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, if there's anything anybody can do, it's and my wife noticed it, for example, and so she's like, well, why don't you just call so and so, and because I can tell that I'm like, all right, I call up my buddy and I find out that they're going through the same stuff, the transition back to civilian life or what have you. So yeah, I don't know.
I didn't realize the transition back. I never thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, that in and of itself can sometimes be not a PTSD type of process, but at the same time, redemption is oftentimes a lot about that too. There are moments where you just you just want to scream because really, this is the worst part of your day. Because let me tell you about the worst part of any given day, and so things like that. You can generalize to just veterans in general, but and it may not be all veterans. It may just but I kind of feel like most of the veterans I've spoken with, old friends and whatnot, we've all kind of gone through the same transitions. Redemption. Coming back to redemption, I feel like that song is as much about my transition and putting it within the context of, how all of us may feel, in particular, guys with, some of these struggles that are a little bit more pronounced, and again, I can't speak from that because I didn't suffer from it, but I do know what it feels like at some level to be that guy transitioning to civilian life and dealing with those things. And so, like I said, it's a sensitive area, I think, for a lot of people, and you have to be very cautious about how you present that.
So is music therapeutic for you then, as far as the stuff you go through, or is that music just something you've always been into?
Therapeutic in the way that
I feel like you get to put the words down in a song, visit.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I had never really given it that much thought until, I've been playing music since I was 12. When I look back at me playing original music and writing songs and things of that nature, I have an unreleased EP of my divorced album, of songs that I recorded that will probably never be put out. But, in terms of, I would say it's autobiographical, all the songs that I write, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's necessary for me to feel good about myself. I.
Well, did it feel good to write all those divorce songs?
I don't know if it felt good. I do know that when I listen back to it, it brings me down again. It's like, oh, geez, man, that sucked. But I think that, yeah, there is some sort of release in a way that once it's out there, you've kind of said what you needed to say, and maybe I can move on or whatnot. But I wouldn't say that I've never set out to write songs in order to feel good. Maybe that's what I want to say.
Okay.
I just write about things that happen to be drifting through my transit. And it's more interesting to do that than to write about, chicks and beer, right? Writing about girls and writing about parties and all of that stuff. I think occasionally you might write a song that might have to do with some sort of sexual, experience, but that's, for me, like in the first album, Sweat, that's me, having a great time in the middle of August, and, it's not necessarily therapy, it's just it's an event that I wrote about that I thought would be kind of cool and to fit the mood of the music.
What's next for Raventree?
I don't know, you tell me.
Well, we are currently...
Right, so for Raventree, we've got, we have the video release coming up in towards the end of this month, towards the end of January. One of the other things we have coming up is we are taking some of our older songs and retracking them, kind of reimagining an alternate mix And the reason for that is like, the history of Raventree was essentially as a solo project up until this past year. Up until then, it had been, I'd been using a revolving cast of characters, great musicians, but not really developing a band that really, was locked in with each other. That first record for me was, I was feeling it as I went. I was figuring out how to make a record while I was making a record. And so even though the songs stood really well on their own as songwriting and the performances were top notch, the overall, feel of the record was not quite what I had wanted to try to ultimately. I didn't know how to get to what I wanted. And so even with a stellar lineup, it doesn't quite sound the way I would have liked. So with this new lineup and the way we play together, I really am excited about capturing those performances with the actual band as it's become, to be more representative of what we are going forward. And it doesn't detract from the earlier album, and the earlier album still stands on its own. But in terms of representing the band, I really wanted to capture how we sound, live, and really kind of presenting the band, Raventree as a band as opposed to Raventree as a solo project.